Hi everyone. Last week in medieval Europe, we as a class discussed how boats can be connected to many different aspects of Scandinavian life during the Viking Age. This conversation inspired the following breakdown of ways in which Viking Age board games can also be used to showcase a variety of these different aspects of life. So the aspects of Scandinavian life that I'm going to examine in connection to board games are the 8 aspects Anders Winroth divides his book, The Age of the Vikings, into. These topics include violence, emigration, boats, trade, political structure, general life for your everyday Viking Age Scandinavian, religion, and art. So, starting with violence in board games, there is some correlation between the skills needed for being a warrior and being good at board games. Both require some amount of strategy. Think of modern games like chess or Risk. This makes particular sense when compared to Winroth's argument about Vikings being opportunists above all. They strategize where and when the best opportunities to get the most amount of loot with the least amount of resistance would be. Playing board games is also a way to bond and would have helped develop friendships between Viking warriors. In addition, Mark Hall in his article, Board Games and Boat Burials, believes that board games were buried specifically with people who were warriors in life, and that being buried with a game set could represent this aspect of their life. Moving on to emigration in board games, the connections of board games to Scandinavian immigration ties in with the connections to violence in ships. In many cases, emigration from Scandinavia involved violence, as Winroth argues when he says that the majority of Viking Age emigration was done in order for chieftains to pursue political power outside of Scandinavia, which was already full of chieftains. In addition, emigration was conducted via ships for at least part of the journey. Most specifically, there is a variety of locations of the buried board games, not just within Scandinavia. Most are, of course, found in Sweden and Norway, but some have been found in Germany, Poland, Iceland, Estonia, Russia, Ukraine, France, England, and Scotland. Now, all these graves have been conclusively proved to be Scandinavians, but at least the one in Scotland was under a boat setting, showing that at least some of these graves outside of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were in fact Scandinavians. Moving on to boats and board games, we find board games from the Viking Age in two places: boat burials and shipwrecks. Because of the shipwrecks, we know that board games were played upon ship journeys, where Hall says that it seems a valid speculation that board games were probably a staple element of a ship's equipment, reminding us of how life on board ships could be a microcosm of that on land. In both contexts, board games allowed social bonding, supported diplomacy, and relieved boredom. This quote goes back towards when we talked about violence in board games and how board games could be used to develop relationships with Viking warriors, but more generally it could be used for that sort of bonding between anyone aboard a ship, whether they were raiding, trading, or emigrating. The second quote on the screen from Hall is, "In life, strategic thinking and fighting ability were fundamental to success on the gaming board, and such success accentuated the status of a warrior. Placing the gaming kit in the grave served to remember or commemorate that status and skill and make it available for the deceased in the afterlife." This quote refers to the board games that were found in the ship burials of Scandinavians and points toward how both boat burials and board games are important in death rituals and how boats and the grave goods within them prepared Scandinavians for their understanding of the afterlife. Now we're going to talk about trade in board games. So to discuss the relationship between trade and board games, let's go back to the list of archaeological finds we looked at when we discussed emigration, this time focusing on the gaming kit column, where we can see the materials the board games and their pieces are made up of. The vast majority of the remains we have are of bone or horn, but in a few cases you can see more exotic materials, including amber in Sweden and ivory in Norway. Neither of these materials is native to Scandinavia, and so having these materials be a part of the board games and buried with Scandinavians in Scandinavia is just one more piece of evidence toward how the Vikings traded all over Europe and beyond. Moving on to political structure in board games, Winroth discusses the fact that political power was gained through a process of violence and gift-giving by chieftains to the warriors who followed him. As a result of the correlations of board games to war strategies and building relationships among warriors, board games are going to be loosely tied to the political structure of Scandinavia. In addition, Hall discusses a grave in Estonia where several men are buried together with gaming pieces, with the king piece extremely close to one of the skeletons. He then wonders whether the placement of this piece could be symbolic of that particular skeleton being a leader of some sort, even perhaps a deposed political leader. Scandinavians were often buried close to home on the family farm. This game board, pictured, was found at the Toftins farm in the Faroe Islands. This section of Winroth's book also touches on gender roles in Viking Age Scandinavia. In general, men were the ones who did the raiding, and this fact seems to go along with the fact that only men have been found buried with board games, furthering the idea that the board games are tied together with the topic of violence. And not only are only men buried with board games, it is typically those who are likely to have a high social status as a result of being a good warrior that are going to be buried with these games. Going back to the discussion about boat burials and board games, religion, particularly ideas about the afterlife, are related to board games. Hall gives several possible reasons why Viking Age Scandinavians may have believed the dead needed a board game in the afterlife. It could simply signify that there's a long journey to the afterlife and a concern of needing entertainment on the way. It could also be because they feared the afterlife would not be peaceful, and so the dead would need to continue to sharpen their skills as a warrior. While I do not have any specific evidence of these next connections to art and board games, it only it would only make sense because of the connection of board games to social status and trade that some versions of board games were made to be customized and artsy in order to being just functional. This idea comes out of the idea of modern board games, which can come in multiple editions based of interest in some form of media, like the various versions of Monopoly and Clue, or even custom made this American Revolution version of a chess set shown in the upper middle. And these sorts of games show that there are more expensive versions than the base version of the games for one reason or another. The artsy version of board games in the Viking Age period may have had more expensive materials or more ornate carvings on pieces or boards. Board games also have mentions in some poetry of the Viking Age, Hall says, such as the Volsupa.